My name is Lala Wilbraham, and I am the child of somewhat eccentric and colorful Catholic Polish émigrés from South America. And I have a book coming out on the 16th of September called The Golden Apple of Samarkand. But before I tell you a little about that, I want to say that I am very touched to have been asked to join in this event. I was asked by Tim Bucknell from your organization, and many of you will know already that some 25 years ago, when Tim was a boy and not well enough to attend school, he used to come to our house with his mother. It was clear from the start that he was a clever and curious child, and that he shared with his father an interest in history, particularly of the Second World War, and particularly of Poland. He was thus intrigued by my mother's accounts of her experiences, starting in September 1939, and of the deportations of many other members of my family to Siberia. I'm grateful to Tim for suggesting I take part in this event, because although my book is a true story lived against dramatic historical events, it isn't a scholarly work. I'm not a historian. I have, of course, relied on learned sources, but amongst your distinguished contributors to this event, I think I could say I'm the plankton at the bottom of your distinguished pond. Actually, I might also tell you that notwithstanding being the plankton at the bottom of your pond, I am nevertheless an extremely important person, because like Her Majesty the Queen, I have 2 birthdays. I was born on the 26th of January 1950, but my birth certificate says the 30th. This is because of forgery by the Argentinian obstetrician, and the reason why is amusing, but as you can imagine, it is the least important fact in my book. Also not very important is the fact that I was born Klara Miecielska, but my passport says Lala Wilbraham. Wilbraham after my husband, of course, but Lala, well, all I can do is apologize to all the Poles who cringe and can barely bring themselves to call me Lala, which in Polish means big doll. So moving swiftly on to the things that do matter, why this book? Because I knew that my family had a very good story to tell, because I knew that this story could be of interest to people outside my family, and because such a book could, should, and hopefully would be a good read, bringing history alive in all its wonders and horrors. And most importantly, because the story goes to the core of being an émigré, and it touches universal themes. So this is a true story. It's a memoir come family history, a tale of splendor and extravagance, of philanthropy, public service, patronage, great visions, and of tragedy and loss. But it is also a tale of great courage, love, humor, and hope. My paternal grandfather's family, the Miecielskis, came from the west of Poland, from just outside Poznań. My paternal grandmother's family from the east. They were Poles from Lithuania. Not surprisingly, when the Second World War broke out, the western lot fled east from the invading Germans towards my grandmother's childhood family home in Lithuania. It is this home in Lithuania that is at the center of my story. This was an estate called Lentvaris, very near Vilnius, which came into my grandmother's family in 1850. The family were the Tyszkiewicz. The estate was called Lentvarów in Polish, but I have chosen to refer to it in my book by its Lithuanian name, since this is what it is known as in the present day. So the story starts in Lentvaris in 1850 and ends in Lentvaris in 2019. Going, of course, through different continents, different wars, political scenarios and generations, eventually following the post-war paths drawn by life for my family, not least in my case via over 20 years in South America. Throughout my childhood in Brazil, in the 50s and 60s, the word Lentvaris evoked vivid images of the heyday of my father's maternal line, and still does today. The splendor and extravagance were breathtaking, and yet, although central to my grandmother's world and to her parents' love, Lentvaris was and is so much more. Throughout the decades of conflict and political turmoil, it was the point of reference for my grandmother's family, the symbol of her parents' union, but also their personal stage on which were played out the much wider patriotic struggles of Poles and Lithuanians everywhere, and their dogged personal battles to defend national identity, regional traditions, and a sense of self. The Tyszkiewicz were Catholic Poles in Lithuania for centuries. In 1569, they were given the title of Count and the right to vote in the Lithuanian parliament, both hereditary. But notwithstanding the fact that they held high offices in the church, in politics, and at court for generations, I see some of the themes in this account as universal. Ultimately, it is a story of clinging to one's moral compass in spite of the ever-shifting loyalties imposed by history and geography, of willing oneself to be a phoenix and not losing one's core. I spent countless hours in a hammock in Brazil with my grandmother, hearing her talk about her life when she was little. But the meat on the bones of my book comes from more reliable sources: history books, published and unpublished memoirs, family, parish and national archives, letters, documents, and indeed several books written about my grandmother's family over the last 10 years by a Polish-Lithuanian historian. The picture that emerged was one that I could welcome, because it is very clear that my grandmother's parents had an extremely strong sense of duty and of noblesse oblige. The newspaper Krai in 1902, number 50, wrote thus about my great-grandfather: Count Władysław Tyszkiewicz is relentlessly driven by the family's all-consuming commitment to public service. Indeed he was. There are many examples. He built a clandestine school in Lentvaris, set up a fire brigade on the estate, established a hospital with 12 beds on his land with a doctor and a nurse, not only to look after those who worked for him, but for the poor in the area, and if some needed the more sophisticated services of the hospital in Vilnius, he sent them there at his expense. He offered free holidays for sick children, set up the Vilnius ambulance service, distributed ear trumpets all over Vilnius, so the deaf amongst the poor wouldn't feel so isolated. And so on. His wife, my great-grandmother, whose maiden name was Princess Maria Krystyna Lubomirska, came from the same tradition of noblesse oblige, had the same drive, and organized many fundraising events to support children's charities and the Children's Hospital. Culturally, too, my great-grandparents were extremely active. My great-grandfather, with his Lubomirski brothers-in-law, plus notable representatives of the music world, founded the Warsaw Philharmonic. The inaugural concert, actually, in November 1901, included the world-famous pianist Jan Paderewski. My great-grandfather also brought plays from Warsaw to the theatre in Vilnius, housing the actors in Lentvaris and battling with the authorities to obtain permission to produce plays in the Polish language. This was all admirable, but what was and is truly inspiring for me was the extent to which my great-grandfather was committed through thick and thin to battle for what was right. And it is his political activity and its repercussions that show him to be a fearless man of principle. In 1904, he gathered signatures of just under 200 of the most important intellectuals in the country for a petition namely a continuation of his battle for the abolition of restrictions against Poles in Lithuania. The demands were for basic national rights, the use of the Polish language in schools, law courts, administrative institutions, and the development of autonomy at local government level, both in the cities and in the countryside, with the active involvement of every stratum of society. This memorandum was personally delivered by my great-grandfather to Premier Piotr Światopełk-Mirski in St. Petersburg in December 1904, and was yet another reiteration of Władysław Tyszkiewicz's views. Since 1897, he had repeatedly argued that peasants, artisans, laborers should all be drawn into public life so that they could have an active political voice. Not surprisingly, the petition was very badly received by the Russian authorities, and in 1905 my great-grandfather only escaped deportation to Arkhangelsk due to the intervention of a few high-ranking Russians who had been his friends since their law school days in St. Petersburg. Thanks to them, he managed to hurriedly board a train and flee to Milan. During his stay in Milan, he was elected in his absence in 1906 as the Warsaw envoy to the First Duma in St. Petersburg. So he returned. The newspaper Kurier Warszawski 1906-121 wrote about him as follows: "He is the embodiment of our striving and yearnings in this dark period. For all the years of his unstinting dedication, Count Władysław Tyszkiewicz is awarded the honor and great responsibility by Warsaw, our capital, of being nominated as the Warsaw representative at the First Duma in St. Petersburg." The same article described him as a person of outstanding caliber and values. There hasn't been a single important public issue, not only in Warsaw but in the whole country, that Count Władysław Tyszkiewicz hasn't been involved in. My great-grandfather came back and took up the post. He was safer for a while, as he was less likely to be arrested whilst in his official appointment in the Russian Duma. But fearless as he was, his voice grew ever louder. As the head of the Polish Council in St. Petersburg, he renewed his fight for political autonomy for Vistula land and submitted a memorandum to Stolypin demanding the cessation of pogroms against the Jews and the granting them a full legal status. When the Duma was dissolved, after only 10 weeks as too radical, the Russian authorities resumed their harsh interference in Poland's internal politics and social affairs. They were again extremely displeased with my great-grandfather, as they saw him as not merely behaving like a representative for Warsaw, but as an overly vociferous Polish patriot, fomenting anti-Russian attitudes on a national scale. This time he was saved from deportation to Arkhangelsk by a combination of Russian friends in high places, money, knowledge of legal procedures, and the fact that his father had been an officer in the Tsar's army. But it was a very close shave indeed this time, as he was already on a train bound for Moscow, accompanied by Russian police, when he heard that exile had been granted after all instead of Arkhangelsk, providing he left immediately. He was taken off the train and he set off for Italy, and on this occasion he was in Milan for 7 years. I have many accounts of those 7 years and the type of life they led. Much of it is entertaining, colorful, personal, but much of it is filled with worry for the motherland, covering also accounts of my great-grandmother's life coming and going between Milan and Lentvaris, her activities on the estate, etc. Of course, it was World War I that brought my grandmother's family back from exile in Milan, a typical example of the shifting of loyalties that Poles have been forced into time and again by history and geography. Here was my great-grandfather, exiled for 7 years because of his opposition to the Tsar's regime vis-à-vis Poles, exiled so as not to be deported to Arkhangelsk, suddenly having to become an ally against the Germans. So he did the only thing he could do. He returned to Lentvaris. He had sold his treasures in 1913, including works by Tiepolo, El Greco, Caravaggio, Turner, Ingres, Poussin, etc., in a massive sale in St. Moritz, and he returned to Lentvaris, offering the estate as a 100-bed hospital to the Russian Red Cross, whilst the Russian Dragoon Cavalry Regiment came to be stationed on the estate. This part of my family history is intriguing to me for several reasons. As the Germans advanced ever closer, the Russian regiment had to leave, and my great-grandfather had to move the hospital from Lentvaris to St. Petersburg, and later, of course, through the Caucasus to Persia, where he was appointed head of the local Russian Red Cross. How my great-grandmother behaved in those years was admirable and dramatic, but what is particularly intriguing to me is that my great-uncle, my grandmother's brother, Stefan Tyszkiewicz, married into the Romanov circle, and it was his mother-in-law who introduced Rasputin to the Tsarina. This great-uncle, Stefan Tyszkiewicz, known as Stetish all his life, was ADC to His Imperial Highness Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, or Nikolasha as he was known. And it was Nikolasha's stepdaughter Stetish married. Nikolasha, you see, was married to Stana Montenegro, daughter of the King of Montenegro, who had a daughter Helena from her first marriage. Stana Montenegro and her sister Milica were hated by the Tsar's mother, and indeed by many others, for introducing the self-styled mystic Rasputin to the Tsarina. This is all very well documented in all books about the Romanovs. The Tsar's mother referred to the Montenegrin princesses as cockroaches. They had other nicknames too, as the Black Peril and the Black Peril and worse, many other such horrible names. And that section of my book was most intriguing to write, not least because of various documents in my great-uncle's file, and indeed personal accounts of Uncle Stetish's wife's foibles and extraordinary eccentricities which made it all come alive. After the massacre at Ekaterinburg, the surviving Romanovs escaped on HMS Marlborough, including my great-uncle Stetish and his family. I have the passenger list, documents in my book, some of which I was only able to find a few years ago, which confirmed the things I had been told by my grandmother when I was a child. Different members of my grandmother's family ended up in different parts of Europe at this stage. Several via Italy, where yet another daughter of the King of Montenegro was queen, wife of King Victor Emmanuel III. After the war, my great-grandparents and their children resumed their life in Lentvaris, which was much changed, of course, since the war. The interwar period saw my great-grandfather's health deteriorate, and I am glad he died in 1936, unaware of the horrors that were to befall many members of his family in World War II. And that part of my family's life struck maybe the loudest chord in me as a child, because I was given first-hand accounts from my grandmother and my parents. From my mother about the German occupation in Poland, the Blitz in London, the eventual exodus to Brazil. From my paternal grandmother, father and aunt, I heard all about the horrors of deportation from Vilnius to the gulags, and everything that followed, including the long trek from Siberia, joining General Anders's army, and that side of the family's departure, also, like for my mother's family, for South America. My aunt and grandmother talked about the horrors of Siberia much more than my father. My grandparents and my teenage father and his sister were in the fourth wave of deportees on the 14th of June 1941, on cattle trains, having up to that point managed to live in hiding in Vilnius. My grandfather was immediately separated from his wife and children, and they never saw him again. Although my family was in the fourth wave, i.e. on the 14th of June 1941, and the instruction to release Polish prisoners came a month afterwards, it wasn't until October that my grandmother, father and aunt were released, and the appalling long trek towards salvation started, killing enormous numbers of people. My family only arrived in Tehran the following year on the 7th of April 1942 and joined the Polish army in June 1942. I have several very moving mementos of that time. The atlas on which my father marked out their trajectory during their deportation. He would have been shot had they found it. Indeed, another person on the same cattle train was shot when it was seen that he was jotting down the names of the little stations on the way. A note from a dying soldier to my 16-year-old aunt, who was a nurse in the desert hospital. A letter from a man who had been in the same labor camp as my grandfather, and who years later tracked down my aunt and father to tell them about him. A precious and poignant memento is a poem written by my father in honor of a brave and humble man who brought comfort to many dying people. My father dedicated this poem in memory of our, in quotes, doctor from the winter of 1941-42 in the steppes of Kazakhstan. I can't translate it as a poem because I'm not a poet, but I will read you my best attempt at conveying it in prose. There was a man amongst us in those days in the steppes, small, thin and fidgety. He scuttled over the hard ground, long nose pointing out every corpse, pointing it out to Mother Earth as if it were her fault. A wolfish yellow tooth protruded from his thick lip, yet the kindest human smile hovered behind it. Snow-white cold wrapped itself around his bony feet. He scurried along the hard, impenetrable soil, among the yellow corpses, blackening like scabs on the bare ground. Grey shaggy sheep, unkempt clumps of life, dotted the steppes, whilst the wind sniggered and chuckled from its hideaways. Deep within the breast of his tattered clothes he gripped a small metal spoon. It was his talisman. He knew its power, its promise of a sequel, its message of hope. Gently he approached each one still breathing, lowered the spoon into dry and empty mouths, lifted stiffened tongues, and with a doctor's gravitas brought meaning to the torment. With this one tiny piece of cutlery, he conjured up images in half-lucid minds of delicacies of long ago. He kept alive their hope that there would be a day when they would eat again. He didn't remonstrate when they called him doctor. The sick dream of health, they'd rather live than rot. So on he went, wearing his doctor's mantle, his title without certificate, a role invented by fate so that they could once again experience what it means to live. And then his own day came. He left the night's embrace with the new dawn in search of those to help, as every day. No longer man, more reed now, bending in the wind, spoon held tight against his chest. The steppe with uncouth harshness vomited snow at the staggering form, until death saw fit to lounge and sprawl upon the land. Small tufts of being dotted the landscape, the same old sheep, grey and shaggy as before. The ground bared its scabs to the rejoicing howls of a delighted wind. All by themselves, tiny flecks of snow gathered into a burial mound. The giant thistles reached out. This never ever ceases to move me. There is no doubt that my father was marked for life by his war experiences. It was like a seeping wound. And it isn't odd that after the war, after the betrayal of Yalta, my family chose a new beginning in South America rather than going back to Poland. My father could never reconcile himself with Yalta, with the fact that even though nobody questioned the Polish contribution to the Germans' defeat, in Yalta in February 1945, 5 years of Nazi slavery were replaced by Soviet slavery for decades. With the First World War, Poland had had the support of the Allies in post-war negotiations. She didn't lose her sovereignty or her borders. Alas, the same didn't happen after the Second World War, when the Americans and the British agreed the Russians could keep the lands they had taken. My father never reconciled himself with this. My aunt was more philosophical, though. She said Churchill's hands were tied without the support of the USA. Yet the last incomprehensible injustice was that the Poles were not allowed to take part in the victory parade in 1946. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, head of RAF Fighter Command, wrote, "Had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the Battle of Britain would have been the same." Here are some figures I came across, which brought it home to me loud and clear. There were 14,000 Polish airmen in 15 RAF squadrons, all with the US Army Air Force. 303 Squadron claimed the highest number of kills, 126, of all the squadrons engaged in the skies over Britain. 4,000 Polish seamen served with the Royal Navy. The Poles worked 6 years to help crack the Enigma code. 43% of all reports the British Secret Service received from continental Europe was from the AK, the Polish underground. The Polish underground resistance was the largest in all of occupied Europe, covering both German and Soviet zones of occupation. And in addition to providing vital military intelligence to the British, they disrupted German supply lines to the Eastern Front and saved more Jews in the Holocaust than any other Western Allied organization or government. On land, Polish ground forces allied to the British or serving under British command numbered 142,000 by the end of the war. A further 200,000 were recruited by the Soviets to fight against the Germans under their command. Polish ground forces took part in key battles: Warsaw, France, Narvik, Tobruk, Normandy, Monte Cassino, Arnhem, Berlin. More than 18% of Poland's population were killed. 38% of national assets lost. Britain lost 0.8%, and France 1.5%. Poland as a country was herself lost until the fall of communism in 1989. Not surprisingly, after World War II, my family, like countless other Poles, wanted to be as far from Europe as possible. My mother's war, fleeing German-occupied Poland, eventual escape to England and ultimate arrival in Brazil, was very different from my father's, but very interesting too, not least since it was bound up with the Bank of Poland's mission to protect the Polish gold bullion reserves from the Nazis. The part of my book that covers the new beginning in South America has perforce a different atmosphere from the first half. South America was where my parents met and married. That is where they led their eccentric and wacky existence, where in spite of everything, a sharp sense of humor and the sense of the absurd prevailed. That is where I was born, and in this part my account becomes a personal memoir. This is where I eventually understood that the impoverishment that the loss of my family's mother country had caused had to be counterbalanced with the enrichment brought about by being catapulted into a totally different world. Holding on to one's identity was vital, of course, but forging a new hybrid identity was essential for healthy survival. My Brazil was and is a country of huge contrasts. I hope I convey all its charm and character in my book. My childhood world was one of huge bustling cities, but it was also the rural paradise of hummingbirds and toucans, macaws and parakeets, an abundance of varieties of fauna and flora, extraordinary fruit, cowboys, horses, alligator hunters, palm trees, spectacular scenery. Although maybe sounding like a kitsch travel brochure, it was a land of sea and sun, of football and bossa nova, of carnival and girls from Ipanema, of sweet friendly people with humor and faith in God. This aspect of Brazil was indeed real, moving, enthralling and life-enhancing. Juxtaposed with this reality, there was of course another, very different one. On the 31st of March 1964, when I was 14, the then President João Goulart, who was proposing to introduce agrarian reform and to remove Brazil from the latifundial economy, was deposed by a military coup. Inflation at the time was running at almost 100%. The elites feared Brazil was going to become another Cuba, and the large landowners and conservative politicians supported the generals. My daily life carried on. I went to school every day, but the years that followed the coup, when constitutional rights were suspended, there were widespread and arbitrary arrests, imprisonment with no trials, rape, castration and murder, not to mention systematic torture and a book-burning mentality. I was certainly aware of all that. People I knew disappeared. There were long lists of prohibited reading considered dangerous, which included the likes of The Red and the Black by Stendhal. Our large canvas army bag, which my mother always took on our holidays with our reading material, took on a different role. In the dead of night, my mother and I drove to the bridge over the Tietê River that flows through São Paulo, and threw the canvas bag and its contents over the side. I shall always remember that splash. I was 14, and my heart constricted as I watched what looked like a human body, a murder victim, being disposed of. These were terrible times, yet alongside these memories I have very vivid ones of simultaneously sharing in the Brazilian national pride that had survived from the 1950s, when Pelé was a hero, when Maria Esther Bueno won Wimbledon, when there seemed to always be Brazilian finalists in the Miss Universe contests, when Brazilian music, both popular and classical, spread well beyond South America and became internationally celebrated and acclaimed, when the Brazilian film industry blossomed. The Brazilian natural ability for joy seemed to survive everything. Carnival never died. I did and do marvel at Brazil. Where could you find such charm, such a desire and hope for progress and the future, even in the face of massive obstacles, such acceptance of fate, such faith in God, such humor? How can they have this peaceful nature despite the huge difference between rich and poor? Are such peacefulness and courage this people's enduring trait? It probably isn't difficult to imagine that going from this Brazil of mine to Poland for the first time in the 60s was a turning point in my life. I was 14, and it was the first time for my mother and aunt after the war. Memories of my life in the tropics jostle with vignettes of this first visit to the past, this visit to what was lost by the other side of my father's family, the Michalskis, who lived in the west of Poland, of images of rows of ancestors in the vaults of a basilica, of the grayness of communist Poland. Later, over the years, other trips to Poland followed, before and after the fall of communism. But it wasn't until 2019 that I finally made it to Lithuania. And that is where my book ends. The process of writing it and the trip to Lithuania have undoubtedly deepened my sense of history, strengthened my Polishness, linked me irrevocably to my grandmother's world, sharpened my perspective by increasing my empathy with people across centuries, not least those in Poland and Lithuania today. It brought into focus the strength of the human spirit, the striving towards a chosen direction against all odds. And I feel that the themes I covered are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Wherever you are in the social spectrum or along the continuum of time, no matter which continent you come from and what caused you to be displaced and ripped from your roots, it is about still knowing who you are and learning to belong again and clinging to hope. Last but not least, I must stress the importance of humor. Even in the darkest moments, humor can give you that little step back, that psychological distance from which even the unbearable can become a little bit less daunting. I hope the humor gives my writing some lightness. I hope my book is a good read. And here, to wind up this presentation, I allow myself the unashamed self-indulgence of quoting a couple of pre-publication comments. Hugo Vickers has described it thus: part history, part autobiography, this is an epic story of courage and survival. And Rula Lenska said, I absolutely loved this book. The author immerses you in her narrative and besieges all your senses. Packed full of extraordinary historical facts and delicious vignettes, it is a roller coaster of life which makes you laugh and cry. A true gem of a family's life across centuries. I didn't want it to end. I hope the learned contributors to this Kresy-Siberia event feel the same.